It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
My guest is Kim Shearer. She's a curator of collections and manager of new plant development at the Morton Arboretum. So I think this will be a really interesting call. I've been to Arboretums myself, and I'll walk through and do the tour, but it's very rare you get to speak to the people that are curating the exhibits. So welcome, Kim. Thanks for coming.
Hi, thank you, Richard. And I'm going to go ahead, you might edit this out later. I had a title change. I just emailed it this morning. So I am the Director of Collections and Curator now.
Okay, excellent. So you're the Director of Collections and Curating. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's we'll get into the Arboretum in 1 second. Tell me a bit about your background. Like, how did you get to work at the Arboretum?
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a typical story, although I guess there's not really typical stories out there. A lot of folks get into horticulture through career shifts or changes in life, and I happen to be one of those folks. So I actually took 10 years off from college till I figured out what I wanted to do. So it was in 2009, after the 2008 election and after the recession was really starting to sink in. I got laid off from my job in retail, and I decided to go back to school. And I knew I wanted to study plants, so I ended up at North Carolina State University in Raleigh studying plant biology. But I quickly learned that horticulture was actually the field that I felt called to at the time. And so that's the career path that I pursued, was horticulture science. And I was fortunate in my undergraduate years to have really excellent internship opportunity at this lab outside of Asheville, North Carolina, called Mountain Crop Improvement Lab. It's a plant breeding lab. They work with a lot of really diverse plants from all different species, all different plant families. And so I went there as an undergraduate with no knowledge of plant genetics, no knowledge of plant breeding, no knowledge of plant propagation, no knowledge of tree usage.
Oh, wow.
The mentor really took a chance on me just because I was so enthusiastic about learning. And I learned about plant genetics. I learned about plant exploration and doing field work. I learned how to measure the genome size of plants. I learned plant identification. I learned how to grow plants and propagate them in a nursery setting. So I learned all those things I didn't know in 3 months. And I generated my first publication doing that. And so I got bit by that bug and realized, okay, I really like plant exploration. I really like research, and I really like woody plants, and I really like plant breeding. So what am I going to do? And so I decided to pursue a path through plant breeding and genetics.
Good. What's it like working with plants? It seems like, I don't know, like being in a monastery, because they can't talk to you. And I would think you spend a lot of time just, silently working on them. But what is it like?
Well, in my position, I actually work with a lot of people. So I do a lot of work with plants. So when I'm out in the field, is when I get to work a lot with plants. And yeah, it's nice being out in the field where it's, quiet. You learn a lot. We were actually just talking about this earlier today, how much you learn when you're working in the field, just because you're there on the ground. You see plants in their habitat if you're out in the wild. And then you also see how what other plants that they're interacting with, whether plants exist there, and what are the conditions on the ground. And you learn so much going from one site to another site. When I'm out in the living collections, it's a little bit different, right? Because this is the cultivated landscape where we're maintaining a living collection of trees and shrubs. And so when I'm out here, I'm more looking at how are these plants performing in this cultivated landscape compared to where you would expect to find them in their natural habitat. So that's a lot of fun. And then I feel like it's, we learn so much every time we're out there. I learn a new plant every time I walk out to the collection. We have almost 25,000 specimens, individual specimens. Wow. Yeah, that doesn't even count all the plants here. It just includes the individual specimens that have a tag on them.
Do you guys have in the back a map of all the planting beds on what's where? So when you walk out, you don't have to go hunt for stuff, what's where?
So we have, for us internally, we have an internal database that has every plant in our collection has a GPS coordinate associated with it. So every time we put a plant in the ground, our plant records coordinator is out there with the shrivel device, and she's capturing the coordinates, and it's pretty precise. And then I can then go out and say, let's say I'm looking for a list of plants. I can just export that data sheet with the coordinates, and then I can populate a map, using an app on my phone, and then just go out into the collections to go find those plants. For the public, we do have an online database. It's bol.mortonarb.org. And so a visitor could go online through our website. They can find that, or they can go to that address, and they can go online and they can maybe search for if there's a species that they're interested in seeing and purchase, or if maybe there's a particular cultivar or plant introduction that they're interested in putting in their landscape, they could, look at our database, do a search on it, and then they could generate a list and a map of the locations, and then use that to kind of determine where they want to go at the Arboretum get here, because it is 1,700 acres. So,
oh my goodness, wow.
It's a lot to explore, yeah.
What do you notice about how certain plants live and interact in the Arboretum versus out in the wild? If there's any that you've seen in both circumstances, or maybe at home you planted some, to see what they'll do. What do you notice the differences between being in that environment and out in the wild?
So I think, the biggest thing that I notice is that plants challenge our assumptions. Right. So we assume a lot of things based on what we observe. And a lot of times that's what we observe in the wild. And so we might observe, plant is adapted to this particular habitat with these very particular conditions. And so therefore, we're going to assume that those are the conditions it probably needs to survive in a cultivated setting. However, plants will surprise you. And so luckily here at the Arboretum, what we've done is we've actually captured all this data every time we bring a plant into our collections. We do the accessioning system. If it's wild collected, we maintain all of the information about its provenance or where it originated. And so I can go into the database and I can say, well, this really great elm tree that's growing in our elm collections is an outstanding performer, survived all these polar vortexes. It's very drought and heat tolerant. Where did we get the seed from? And I go to the database and I can see that. And in some cases, the seed comes from, the furthest point of Texas. And it's a species that, in all other reports that you'll find online or in any books, is reported to only be cold hardy to zone 6, which is, a little bit south of us. We just, the Arboretum, or DuPage County where we're located, the USDA just generated a new cold hardiness zone map recently, and we're now borderline zone 5B and zone 6A. But, for the past several, for the decades preceding this, let's say this tree was planted in the 70s. From the 70s to, I don't know, the 90s or further to the 2000s, we were living in cold hardiness zone 5. And so, we would assume that species wouldn't survive in this landscape here. And so a homeowner wouldn't plant it, or gardener wouldn't plant it. But at the Morton Arboretum, we are experimenting. And so we plant things. And then that way, in a couple decades or a few decades, so from the 70s all the way to before now, so it's like 50 years, we can look at a tree and say, oh, you're actually a lot hardier than we assumed you were. And so that to me is the most surprising thing or the most interesting thing about our collection.
Well, I mean, a lot of plants will sit in the same soil. I don't think they're segregated. So I would think their their microbiomes are interacting, and you have plants that would never normally be next to each other interacting, through the soil and the air. So do you have like a quarantine when you bring in a new plant? What if you bring in one that you just don't know has some disease and it like kicks, it attacks a whole bunch of other plants near it and ruins a part of the arboretum?
That's a great question. So the way plant exchange works across borders is there is a system in place, a regulatory system in place. So if we were importing things from a nursery or something, those plants have gone through an inspection process. And so they have a certificate associated with them. That nursery undergoes an inspection process as well. And so there are some controls in place for, nursery products. When it comes to other plants that are not nursery products, let's say, you receive a plant from another public garden or another botanical garden or arboretum, they would also have, before shipping it across borders or exporting it across state borders, they would have had an inspection done if there were any known issues with those particular plant species. If I'm going out into the wild to collect seed, I'm going to be cleaning that seed and sanitizing that seed. And so we do have systems in place that help to control that spread from us. Now, we cannot control our visitors, right? So a visitor can go walk somewhere with their shoes on, and they might pick up a pathogen on their shoes that they didn't know they were capable of transporting on their shoes, and then they could introduce that to the arboretum. Or someone could be driving, somewhere in the eastern region of North America on a road trip and then come, across the country to the Morton Arboretum for a visit as we're driving along, I-88 or something. And maybe they have spotted lanternfly, egg masses underneath their vehicle, and they introduce that into the Arboretum just by, driving around the country. So like those types of things we can't control, but we do control how we bring material into our Arboretum, how we distribute material.
What about the order in which people go through the arboretum? You said you can't control people going here, there, everywhere, and coming with stuff on their shoes, on their clothes, etc.
On their cars, yeah.
On their cars, yeah. So maybe like the first thing they go into in the arboretum consists of plants that are particularly hardy and won't be affected negatively by all the stuff coming in off the street. And then deeper into the arboretum, now that they've walked around and maybe stuff's come off of them, they're less likely to contaminate an inner area. So is the arboretum structured in that way? Can you provide any protection to certain more sensitive areas by having other plants on the outside as like a barrier, let's say? Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't. Sorry. I'm just trying to imagine something like, we don't really have.
Like what if you go through like an air shower, let's say, before you go into this one sensitive area of the arboretum? So they have that.
I don't think it's necessary to do those types of things in this type of setting.
That's okay. I just wondered,
Yeah.
I imagine maybe some stuff's real sensitive. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's if things are sensitive, they're sensitive. But the purpose of a living collection is, obviously we have a germplasm here, right? So we're trying to collect all different types of plants, all different types of species, and all different types of genetics. But the other thing that we're doing here is we're evaluating things. And so, let's say, you have Dutch elm disease, right? The American elm got devastated by Dutch elm disease all over Eastern North America, and especially here in Chicagoland. American elms are part of the floodplain forest, and they were used very widely as seedling native trees that were grown by nurseries and planted all along neighborhood streets and the parks. And then Dutch elm disease was introduced on a burl log that was sent, from Europe for woodworking in the early 1900s. And, that's not even like nursery product moving across borders. That's just a dead log, right? And so an insect was introduced that was carrying the pathogen. And then, by the time you actually identify that the pathogen has been introduced, it's kind of late. It's like the cat's out of the bag, right? Like you can't put it back in. So then what do? Well, you could try to contain it, but it's hard to really track the movement of it, right? And so one thing that you can do, instead of trying to control it by, doing all these things, investing all these resources in containment, you can, let things unfold a little bit and see what happens. And so in the case of the American elm, we lost a lot of American elms, but we also identified American elms that had disease resistance, right? Because they were still left around and standing. We also identified other elm species that had resistance or tolerance to the disease as well. And so today we have, elms and elm species, different cultivars of those elm species that have been introduced through the nursery industry because they've been developed through plant breeding and selection because Dutch elm disease came along, and we were able to observe the effects of that. So we have disease-resistant elm introductions. So I think, controlling things as you can try to control things to a degree. However, sometimes, you have to allow nature to take its course and identify those opportunities that emerge out of that process. It's something that's going on right now with ashes and emerald ash borer. A lot of, our green ashes, which are also a floodplain forest species, are lost through the introduction of EAB. Again, not introduced through the nursery trade, introduced through shipping, global commerce, right? And so that particular situation also could not have necessarily been controlled. But once EAB was here, it was here, and we didn't realize it until it was a little bit too late, right? So now that we know it's here, we can prevent the continued spread of it, but ultimately it's going to spread. All we're doing when we control it is we slow down the spread so that researchers have time to really investigate what's going on and then how to address it with creative solutions. So today with EAB and green ash, what we have is the U.S. Forest Service was able to identify, native ashes that are resistant to the introduced pest. And so they've used those resistant ashes to then develop a breeding program that can be used for reforestation purposes, but then also be used for developing new trees for the landscape.
Yeah. What kind of pests do you guys have at the Arboretum? I guess the unique thing is you guys are totally different from, monocrop agriculture. So do you think that provides protection, that you have so many different kinds of plants that even if one gets sick, it's unlikely it'll jump to another one that's different from it?
Right. So I think I like where you're going with that. So the best thing to do when you're planting in a landscape is to, divide things up, right? Create those barriers by splitting things up are so much more alike. So, maybe not putting everything of the same species all in one location together, like a monoculture. So at the Morton Arboretum, we do, I feel like the genetic diversity of our collection, is particularly our geographic collection, does provide some safeguarding for some of those things, right? So we have different types of collections. We have geographic collections, and then we also have taxonomic collections. I would say the taxonomic collections tend to be the ones that would be more at risk if there was an introduction of an invasive pest or insect pest or disease. So an example would be our ash collection. Having everything our elm collection, having everything planted together is going to increase the chances of if something comes in and, it can be hosted by all of these things, it could wipe out your entire collection. However, we're fortunate that we have 1,700 acres, so we can also have geographic collections. So what we do is we'll replicate things. So say I get, 9 of a species grown in our nursery, and I'll plant 3 in one of the taxonomic collections on one side of the Arboretum, 3 on the other side of the Arboretum, and I'll plant 3 in a geographic collection. So that way, if anything happens to a particular site, then we still have some of that material safeguarded, and we haven't put all our eggs in one basket, right? So that's a great point. So we try to create that genetic diversity in the landscape and also have backup measures.
Since you have so many plants, do you have a lot of scientists that contact the Arboretum and want to come in and study the different plants, or do you interact with other Arboretums? And, you have 25,000, they have another 12,000 you don't have, and, do you collaborate?
Of course, yes. So, public garden world is highly collaborative with each other, with research, and there's research within the public garden world. So here at the Morton Arboretum, I do research. I also oversee a plant breeding program that does research, and a plant healthcare program that does research with plant diseases and entomology. And then the plant breeding program does research, and introducing new plants and all the information related to those plant introductions and the species that they're working with. And then we also have the Center for Tree Science here at the Morton Arboretum in our Department for Science and Conservation. And they use the collections for their research. So we have old forestry plots that were planted here, 100 years ago. Some less have been around less long or for less time. And so the forestry plots are really great resources for our researchers here because those are monocultures, right? And so a monoculture is bad when you want, trees to survive after the introduction of a pest or disease, but good when you want to do some research on a tree species and you want to eliminate as many environmental variables as possible. So our researchers use those monoculture tree plots to answer interesting questions about microbial community in the soil and how a species affects that. And then we also have researchers looking at, root characteristics. And then as far as external researchers, we do allow folks to request material from us. So we have many requests each year are asking for material to do sequencing work on because we have access to, material that they don't necessarily have access to, right? Whether it's like from another country or even from this country, doing that wild plant exploration is a lot of work. And then we also provide resources to, as far as exchanging material. We have collaborative organizations. One is called NAPTEC, which stands for North America China Exploration Consortium. And that's a program that was started in the 1980s, I believe. And what came out of that was an organization of North American public gardens from cold periods zone 5 and colder that work with other institutions in China, forestry, botanic garden institutions, academic institutions to exchange plant materials. So we go over there and we did exploration and collection and brought that back to North America, and then also have sent stuff back over to China for the collections on that side of the ocean. And so then what we can do collectively is not only are we preserving genetics and conserving species, but we're also safeguarding all those species in different climates to, mitigate those impacts of climate change on the genetics that are available.
Have you had anyone come in and look at like the soil microbiome and see how, like, let's say you have some kind of ash tree or whatever, elm, compare that to like one in the wild and see how it changes, because a new plant comes in, again, after a short time, I would think in the soil, things start interacting. So I would expect the microbiomes of the different plants, the rhizosphere, to look different because they're in a different context with other plants.
Yeah, no, we haven't had anybody do that in the collections, but we do have a soil ecology lab here. And so the soil ecology lab, their expertise is in mycorrhizal fungi. So they look at those types of interactions in the soil, mycorrhizal fungi interacting with tree roots. And then they also look at soil composition in different parts of our natural areas in the forest, as well as looking at different things happening in those forestry plots that are monoculture.
What about the people that come? What do you notice about, does anyone watch them as they go through the Arboretum? Or, if you look at comments or questions, like what do you notice about people's behavior and how do they experience the Arboretum in ways that are surprising or interesting, or, oh yeah, people always do that at this point?
I think many people who come to the Arboretum tend to stay focused in the core area, what we refer to this as the core area of the Arboretum. We are a very large space. And so the core area is where the visitor center is located. We have a beautiful lake with meadow planting around it. And then we have a nice conifer collection over there. So we have all these really nice amenities, a children's garden that's really fantastic that draws a lot of visitors. So a lot of folks actually just come here and they hang out in this core area where there's a lot of gardens. It's more cultivated. Typically out in the collections areas, people are out there to go hiking, right? So they're going for these nice hikes. And the way our trail systems have traditionally been set up is they kind of go by the collections, and you're allowed to walk off the mulch trail. We encourage it. If you want to go look at plants, of course, you should go look at the plants in the collections. But a lot of people tend to follow the path that you give them. And so what we've started doing at the Morton Arboretum is we're trying to revise those trail systems. So we take people or visitors through the collection. So then they actually see the plants that are in the collections. And then we can highlight those new plants for people that maybe likely have never encountered them before because they're not necessarily the plants that you would find at a garden center, right? And so I think that's typically how people interact with collections. They're just hiking through them. And then a lot of folks like to also go to our west side of the Arboretum where we have the Thornhill Education Center. There's a nice kind of cultivated area there with like a fragrance garden and this really beautiful path that has like lots of gorgeous gardens around it. Or the more naturalist folks might go out to the Schulenburg Prairie, and that place is also really gorgeous, and it changes throughout the seasons.
Okay. What do you think? What is the future of the Morton Arboretum and other arboretums that you've seen? Like, where are they? Is there a trend in where they're headed, or it's just the continuation of what you guys are doing?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, right? So I think with a place like the Morton Arboretum, and we're not alone in this, the intention behind developing the collections and the institutions was to collect plants and evaluate them in the landscape, which essentially generates something that we refer to as a germplasm repository. So you're collecting genetics from different places, from different species. And so a lot of public gardens, that's what their mission is, right? And then having that stuff, observing in the landscape, you're evaluating. So that's typically the, mission, other than just, also, the add-on to that is educating the general public about plants and gardening and horticulture. So that's the general mission of a lot of places. I think what that has set us up to do very effectively and successfully is kind of lean more into that conservation side of things. And so that's the direction you're seeing a lot of institutions going in now. So there's science and conservation departments at different institutions now, and we're all working together to conserve genetics at multiple locations of various species, depending on what our growing climate is. And so something that have evolved out of that or emerged out of that is organized by Botanic Garden Conservation International, BGCI, and through BGCI, our public garden system has developed networks of meta collections. And so we all curate our data together. So we all know we have a database that we can basically find any species and every collection that it's located in around the world, right? And then we can say, okay, well, based on these growing conditions of all these different locations, what is this species adapted to? And also we can say, okay, well, this species is not very well represented in public gardens yet. And so perhaps we need to go out and capture that genetic diversity. And so that helps us to develop objectives and strategies for plant exploration.
Okay, well, very good. Where can people find out more about the Morton Arboretum? Like, what's the website? And, you guys are open through the rest of this year. Any times you're closing, or you're going to be available for visitors?
We're always open. Unless there's very, 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 very severe weather, like a significant polar vortex, we're always open. We don't always have visitor services available, like on Christmas Day. There's not going to be anybody working in the visitor center, but we're always open. And our website is mortonarb.org.
Okay, very good. Well, Kim, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been very interesting to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Have a great day.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.